More than 100 colleges and universities have made the SAT optional for the next school year because of the pandemic, and that includes the entire University of California school system, who might end up doing away with the tests forever. NBC News correspondent Antonia Hylton is covering this story for the Report on Quibi. It's a show produced by NBC News. Antonia, colleges and universities have been thinking about ditching this requirement for these tests for quite a while now. Can you remind us why?
That's right. I mean, the debate over the fairness of these tests, the SAT and ACT, that's been a raging debate for decades, arguably, but it's really been heating up the last several years. And it breaks down into two camps. So you have educators and administrators who argue that these test scores are really helpful indicators of how a student is going to perform, of how they're going to do on campus. It gives you a full picture of their academic performance. And then you have educators and advocates who argue, actually, these test scores mostly just tell us whose parents have the most money to pay for test prep. And that was, of course, a conversation that came up in 2019 when the Varsity Blues cheating scandal happened. And so it's really rocked California, and the UC system was debating this prior to the pandemic. And now the pandemic has really kicked this debate into high gear.
We've seen some students preparing for this throughout their entire high school careers. What kind of impact will this have for prospective students, and what does this mean for them?
So the SATs and ACTs, it's no secret that it's always been very stressful for students who see this next step for them after graduating from high school, of course, as critical. And the students who we focus on for this upcoming report are students who are low income, of color, maybe English was their second language. And for them, accessing test prep, their parents may not have the money for that. They may never even be able to dream of getting a fancy tutor. And so they're watching classmates or people they know around them, in this case, in the state of California, go to these things, access these things, their parents set them up for them. And that adds a layer of anxiety that, for them makes some of these schools feel almost completely just unattainable. And now add the pandemic to that, and you look at low-income kids who are living in tight quarters at home. Their parents may have lost work, and all of those things I just described are exacerbated. And that's the case for Haley, a student who I spoke to who's in the Santa Ana area in California.
For 4.0 student Haley Gomez-Wagner, a lot was riding on this. She's from a lower-income family in the Santa Ana area, and she wants to get into UCLA, the most sought-after campus in the University of California system. The day after we visited Haley's class, she found out that the SATs were canceled due to the pandemic.
It's really different. Last semester, it was, oh, let's prepare for the SAT, let's get ready. It's going to be the biggest test ever. And then now it's like, are we even going to be able to take it in person?
Because of the countrywide shutdown, more than 100 colleges and universities, UCLA included, have made standardized tests optional for the 2021 school year.
So all eyes are really on this right now in California. There's a critical vote coming up on May 21st, which is just a couple days away. And the UC system is going to decide, in the midst of this pandemic, a lot of colleges and universities have decided these tests aren't essential right now. Are they actually going to ever be essential again?
It's so hard to state how massive that UC school system is. If they ditch this requirement, is there a sense that other schools might follow?
Absolutely. I mean, educators and activists around the country are going to be watching this historic Zoom meeting that's happening in just a couple days. Look, the UC system is considered one of, if not the most prestigious public college system in the country. And they have been leaders on everything in education, really. They were actually one of the early adopters of these high stakes tests. And back then, all these colleges and universities copied them. So there's a lot of anticipation, a lot of expectation that if they decide, hey, actually, we don't need these things anymore. We've filled up a wonderful class for the 2021 school year, and these test scores made no difference, didn't help us at all. And they decide, well, then we're never going to use them again. People expect it to be like an avalanche. If the UC system does it, they don't think these are essential, then why should we?
It's going to be so interesting to see how this develops. Thanks so much, Antonia.
Thank you for having me.
And you can watch Antonia's full report, the full story on The Report. That's by NBC News. Just download the Quibi app on any mobile device.
Thank you. You too.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.